Hello everyone and welcome back to another video here. So we are here with part 2 of Raids Ranked. Now, of course, the raids we have left, you should go watch the previous video. If the raid that you are looking for is not here, it is going to be in part 1. Go check out Dungeons Ranked as well for that kind of stuff, for the dungeons as well. The dungeons is all in one video. The raids I did have to split up because I have a lot more to talk about these. I have more raid clears than dungeon clears, and some of these raids, they got some oomph to them. Also, again, I want to showcase a little bit more of these raids as a whole. So for those reasons, these things are, I'm going to be talking about them for a little bit longer. Now, in case y'all have not watched a previous video, I usually for these I have a fun fact for you. I do have a different one for general raids, but each raid has a fun fact. The dungeon videos, I did a fun fact for all the dungeons. Uh, they are not generic fun facts or that sort of thing. They're usually pretty niche. Some of them were so hard that I kind of had to go pretty general. For these 5 raids, a lot of these are going to be oddly specific or kind of random. So we're kind of in that territory here. Now, just to do a little bit of recap, the previous fun fact for part 1 was there are no unique hive raids in Destiny 2, meaning that the only hive raids in Destiny 2's history are from D1. And yes, before I'll say Crown of Sorrow, it was also Cabal. It was both Cabal and Hive. So for those reasons, at least to my knowledge, of course, I didn't do the raid myself, outside of Galran himself. Now, in the previous video, we did cover all 4. We covered Insurrection Prime, Callus, Galron, and Argos. Only those bosses, but again, those were not tied into the rank, so I had those being separate. And then, of course, rounding up last place, we had at number 9, Root of Nightmares. That had the only Stasis raid and dungeon exotic, and it is also the only fully playable Cabal raid in the game. Then it was in D tier. Now, Desert Perpetual was in D tier as well, and that fun fact was only raid to not have an ad clear encounter. And then keep in mind, Salvation's Edge got skipped. Salvation's Edge got skipped, but that has the largest witness. Like the witness is the largest boss model in Destiny history. But Salvation's Edge was skipped because I have not ran it in full and won't ever run it in full, mainly because of how the state of rating is in the game. But then, of course, was Garden of Salvation at number 7, and it was in C tier, so a full tier above. And Garden has the last exotic to come from a raid, dungeon, or exotic mission. We have never gotten an Arc exotic from a dungeon or an exotic mission. We have only gotten them from raids, and Legend of Acreus, Leviathan's not in the game, and Anarchy, which came from Scourge of the Past, is also not in the game. Outside, of course, their full raids are not in the game. So, out of all 3 of those activities, like, Garden is the only one that has an Arc exotic. And keep in mind, Acreus you get from the kiosk. Anarchy you get from the kiosk. Then, rounding out number 6 was Vault of Glass, which was the only raid and dungeon to have multiple encounters take place in the same area multiple times. Because Confluxes, Templar, and Oracles takes place in the same area, and then Aethon and Gatekeeper takes place in the same area. No other raid does this. Now, we're going to go ahead and get into, the top 5. And before getting to top 5, your fun fact. There is only one raid there are no raids that start with the vow. They are. There's actually only one dungeon that starts with the vow, and that is Equilibrium. So across all raids and dungeons, only one starts with the vow, and that is Equilibrium. There you are. Again, these are general shit that takes it is a fat oof to even try to come up with. But on that note, just going to get into it. Now going into our top 5. At number 5, we do have Vow of the Disciple, and it is in A tier. Now keep in mind, top 3 raids are reserved for S tier. Also keep in mind, these raids were very, very close together. These top 5 raids were extraordinarily close, and there's maybe a couple things separating them. But your fun fact here for Vow of the Disciple is it is the first Void exotic to come from a raid or dungeon in Destiny history. and in the exotic missions in Destiny 2 history. And of course, this raid is an A tier. But that is correct. None of the previous raids had a Void exotic tied to it, and the dungeons that released before Vow of the Disciple, there weren't that many. There was only Pit of Heresy, Solar, Shadow Throne, Kinetic, Prophecy, no exotic tie-in, and Grasp of Avarice was Solar. However, in terms of exotic missions, we did not get one until, if you skip Dead Messenger, which I did skip for the Arc Exotics because those weapons that are multi-element, unfortunately, like a lot of those multi-element exotics are, you know, like you can't. I don't count them as their one particular element. But we did not get our first true Void exotic mission until Lightfall, in which we got technically the Deterministic Chaos and Vex Caliber, and of course Vow the Disciple released with Witch Queen. So yeah, even then it took it quite some time in order to us to get one. And then Dungeons, we did get one that year, and that was Duality. So we did get a bunch of Void Exotics that year, but before Vow of the Disciple, no raid, dungeon, or exotic missions had Void Exotics. So that is a little bit of a fun fact for y'all. Now, for Vow of the Disciple here. Vow of the Disciple also did not win a single award. Didn't do anything terrible, but it also wasn't the best in any particular category either. And for categories, of course, we usually talk about difficulty, experience, spectacle, music, loot, and then extras. But first, we're going to get into difficulty. Now, of course, difficulty, it was tied with one of the raid that is higher than it in terms of difficulty. And then, of course, it was also tied with Desert Perpetual for difficulty as well. And I will discuss the high-end ties if there are one, and I'll be mentioning some maybe raids are in the past as well. But so yeah, Vow, it was in that top 3 in terms of difficulty. Keep in mind, Salvation's Edge is not included, so keep that in mind. But Desert Perpetual, another raid that's higher, and Vow the Disciple, where I did consider to be the hardest raids. However, there was one that I thought was slightly more difficult, and in which I'll get into those reasons when I get there. But Vow the Disciple, the reason why I don't think it's the absolutely easiest raid is, again, in order for you to be considered a non-easy raid, you cannot get through the entire raid by doing ad clear. Which in this raid, you can't, without doing some cheesy stuff. Under normal circumstances, you cannot get through the entire raid with pure ad clear because of the third encounter. The third encounter, you have to do something. Also, generally speaking, even in the first encounter, keep in mind, first encounter is not the same as the opening encounter. The opening encounter is a little sparrow section thing where you have to pick up the beams. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the actual first encounter. Under normal circumstances, how that encounter is supposed to operate, there is also not supposed to be any ad clear either. Really, only the 2 boss encounters really have ad clear on them. And speaking of which, because this is one of the little bit harder ones and we're going to kind of be up here, I'm going to be discussing a little bit of encounter mechanics, not too in-depth, but, you know, because, again, we're talking about these top-tier raids, gotta discuss them. So, in the first encounter, keep in mind, I did do this on day 1. We got past the first encounter, but it was extraordinarily difficult. How it's normally supposed to be ran is essentially in the middle, left, and right. You have 3 teams of 2. So you have 1 team of 2 in the middle, 1 on the right, 1 on the left. And the purpose is 1 person on each team of 2 is supposed to stay at the totem thing and ad clear while the other person goes out. However, the person that is ad clear, that's not the only thing they're supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be looking at the glyph, and when their glyph has 3 symbols on it, that's one of them. Yeah, you have to call out Light Knight or Dark Knight because they're going to be on, because that's going to determine where the knight's going to spawn. So the runner, who's the other person, can go out and do their thing. Then ad clear has to again read the middle, right, and tell them which door to go into, and then which score and symbol to be looking at. So the person that is ad clearing is actually doing something to help push the encounter along. Now, what you can do is you can technically have 1 true ad clear roll and only have 2 runners, but I personally don't necessarily like running it that way. Also, generally speaking on LFG, at least in recent time from what I've gathered, most people don't care for running like this either, unless somebody doesn't have a mic or something like that happens. Most people don't care for doing that. Technically speaking, you can have one person ad clear, and then you can technically do a different 2-2-2 in terms of two people going around reading the glyphs, two people actually just pure ad clearing, and then two runners. However, no one really likes running it that way. It's more complicated than it needs to be. Yet, of course, you have Caretaker. The runner role is not exactly simple when you go in the door. So, an experienced runner will know what wall to look at. They'll go in, pick at the symbols. The second they come out, the other person goes in. Then you do that on the rest of the floors. The ad clear points are pretty ad clear rolls, right? They're simple. The stunning roll is also very simple. The hardest thing about Caretaker is one, the running roll itself, but two, the making sure you're standing on the same plate at the same time. But that's the hardest part of that. The third encounter is where there actually is no ad clear encounter. However, some teams will go around this by, shooting a rocket at their feet, and then somebody reviving them so they can, because it clears their debuff, and they can re-pick up the artifact. Most teams do not do this. It is extraordinarily rare. It is unless we're carrying some absolutely actually trying to carry, or we just don't have enough people. That's when you do that. And then of course for final boss Rolk, this is the one aspect I'm not the biggest fan of. Realistically speaking, really 3 people are ad clearing the entire time. The one person is just swapping buff, but there really is no purpose to them other than to be that buff holder. That's kind of it. Really only 3 people are doing the mechanics, which I'm not the biggest fan of that for ad clearing for final bosses as well. That's another reason why I just didn't consider it to be difficult enough, and that's why I also did consider Desert Perpetual to be slightly more difficult than here, but there is another raid that is even harder than this, because this kind of thing doesn't really exist in what I define to be the hardest raid, because again, the mechanics are not super intense in Vow Disciple. However, they are decently involved. The raid gets easier as you progress through the raid, in my personal opinion, not necessarily harder. And the bosses are easier than the non-boss encounters, which I'm not the biggest fan of that being the case, so that's something else. Now, in terms of experience, I gave this raid a 7 out of 10 in terms of experience. I think it's a pretty good experience in totality. However, I'm not the biggest fan of spam running this raid necessarily, and this raid can go from a oof to a pretty good in a quick minute, and that's because of the parkour section specifically. People can be left behind quite easily, so that is kind of. But again, this raid is a pretty good experience. It's just not the best experience, and here's what I will say. For all 4 of the remaining raids there is a step in terms of fun between Vow of the Disciple and the top 4. There is a step up. And of course, however, out of all of the raids, I do think this is probably the best experience. Again, I tied this with Vault of Glass only because I think Vault of Glass is a great experience for newer players. Vow of the Disciple, I think, is a perfect experience. I think it's a good experience for kind of mid-level raiders. So that's where I would have that. Now, in terms of spectacle, this one was a 4-way tie. Keep in mind, 2 of the ties are higher, but again, it did lose to Garden of Salvation. Garden of Salvation did end up getting that award, so Vow of Disciple didn't beat Garden. However, here is even why it got that many points in the first place for Spectacle. 1, it was the first raid to do the pyramid aesthetic. It was the first raid to do the pyramid aesthetic. You will lose points for me by constantly doing the pyramid aesthetic. That's why Rune of Nightmares lost points. That's also why when I have seen a decent chunk of Salvation's Edge, my original Salvation's Edge rank, that was one of the reasons why it was ranked so low. It's because it was the 3rd time in a row of doing the pyramid aesthetic. So again, this was the first raid to do it. But also the giant worm in the middle was pretty cool. The Rolk, I like Rolk and Caretaker's boss designs. Caretaker does remind me a little bit of the Solomon Grundys in Bloodborne that have a casket on their back. They do Caretaker reminds me of that a little bit. Definitely an unintended reference, but that's where I kind of, reminds me of. Then I really do actually like Zrok's design as well. So, for being the first Pyramid raid, really cool, and the worm being in the background, it is honestly a phenomenal looking raid, especially being the first of the Pyramid aesthetic raids. So, that's why it got full marks for spectacle. Not anything I can say negative necessarily about the spectacle, right? But on to, again, music. In case you did not watch part one, for music specifically, I decided not to really, like, if it's mid or whatever, I'm not really going to discuss the music here. That's where I'm going to be at with this raid. This is the last raid that I will not be talking about the music for. This is the last raid I'm not be talking about the music for. Now, keep in mind, this and number 4 were not tied. This and number 4 were not tied, so just keep that in mind. But we did have I'll mention ties when we get to the upper echelon here. When we get to the upper echelon, but because those rates that we get into in the top 4 are truly interchangeable for me. However, in loot, Vow to the Disciple got almost full marks. Almost full marks. Almost. It was tied with another raid, but it's in the top 4. Only one raid got full marks for loot. Only one raid did. Now, keep in mind, as I'm saying this, raid exotics, generally speaking, did not play a major factor in terms of loot as a whole. If they would sometimes swing ways a little bit positively, but raid exotics are mid as a whole. Almost none of them are best in slot. I think you could argue. I think the only two raid exotics that you could argue being best in slot is 1K and Divinity. I think those are the only two exotics, and listen, I'm an Anarchy lover. In my opinion, I think those. However, I don't think you can argue that for. I don't think you can argue Anarchy for best in slot. Best in element in slot. I think that's when you can start to argue Anarchy. Because in terms of arc exotic heavies, I think you can argue Anarchy is the best out of them, right? However, Vow to the Disciple's exotic is just kind of mid tier. There's a build that you can do for it. That's how I'm defining all these exotics. Unless the exotic is absolutely abhorrent, that's when, I'll start, you'll be docked some points for the exotic. But, the exotic is alright. Again, raid exotics have been mid for fucking ages now. And similar situation for Dungeons exotics as well, except Grasp of Avarice being the exception. Because Gjallarhorn. And Warlord's Ruin is also another exception, same with Navigator. So Dungeon exotics have a whole have done a little bit of a better job than raids, and that shouldn't be the case in my opinion, but I digress. However, the reason y'all should already know the reasons why this has got almost top marks. Only one other raid tied with it, so it did get a 9 out of 10. Forbearance, Submission, Cataclysm, and Lubray's Ruin as an honorable mention. This raid's origin set is cracked. And especially when it released, it was broken. And it's still probably to this day, at least in my personal opinion, Vow to the Disciple probably has the best raid origin trait. Same with Dungeons as well. I think the ones that you could argue for is Vault of Glass and maybe Deep Stone Crypt. But one reason why I'm saying maybe is because that origin trait is pretty minor. Even when you enhance the origin trait, it's pretty minor. But I think the other one you could argue is Vault of Glass because of Rocket Launcher. But Forbearance, right? The thing was king. The thing was king for ages and is still really, really good. Submission, also phenomenal kinetic SMG as well. Deliverance is also a very solid stasis fusion rifle with chill clip. It did not launch that good though, because it took too many hits to actually freeze an enemy. So a different stasis fusion rifle that dropped from Crucible ended up being the go-to for quite a long time. But Deliverance has kind of gone back up. And of course, Cataclysm was the initial release of Bait and Switch, so there was the start of having Bait and Switch on your heavy weapons being meta. But I think the role in particular was 4 times the charm in Bait and Switch, so it was a absolutely goated time. And now Lubray's Ruin, again, we barely have any endgame glaives outside of exotics. So Luberry's Ruin is solar. Origin trait is still quite nice. Its new perks are decent as well. Now, the reason why it did get docked points was because I'm not a huge fan of the armor set bonus and Insidious as well. Insidious is the Arc Pulse Rifle. I could be misremembering the name, but the Arc Pulse Rifle from Valor the Disciple is also not that good. It just ain't that good. So, for those reasons, um, it did lose 1 point mainly for the armor, but outside of that, top marks for loot, right? And in order to have top marks, you have to have memorable legendary weapons. Those memorable legendary weapons are Cataclysm and Forbearance. So gotta have some weight there. But then, of course, you have the extras. First off, the armor set looks good. The armor set looks great. Probably, at least for a very, very long time, it was my personal favorite raid armor. Honestly, to this day, it probably still is, but I've come around to some, like, Deep Crypt armor. Well, Crota's End is number one, of course, but after Crota's End is Vow of the Disciple in terms of total armor set on Titan, Warlock, and Hunter, right? Like, on some pieces, I might prefer other raids for. Like, for instance, Deepstone Crypts, I do like on Titan, but I think I prefer Hunters a little bit more. King's Fall, I love Warlocks, for instance. King's Fall, like, that's where my favorite Warlock stuff is. And I do like Hunter and Titan for Vault of the Glass, but in terms of totality, number one is Crota's End, of course, and then Vow of the Disciple, though, is that number two. So, looks-wise, it's great. However, I don't like the Flawless shader, so it did lose a point for the Flawless shader. I don't mind how the Secret Dress operates, and it does have the red border shenanigans. I'm not the biggest fan of that necessarily either, but it does come with a cool exotic sparrow when you start working on the title and whatnot. So for those reasons, and it also was one of the first sparrows to have an actual unique trail. Like, the unique trails for sparrows was extraordinarily rare, especially for raids, and it did not start until after Vow of the Disciple came out. But it was absolutely fun. Like, the rest of the stuff was pretty cool, so it did get in an 8 out of 10. However, it couldn't beat the number 4 raid because of those things. Now, of course here, we will next be discussing our number 4 spot. Alright, and in our number 4 spot, we have Last Wish. And of course, Last Wish is also an A tier. However, something I will point out here is Last Wish and our number 3 raid were tied. But the number 3 raid, I think, just barely. Again, number 3 and 4 in 1 and 2 were the raids where you could change them. So, like, 1 and 2 could change, swap between on any given day. And, again, our number 4 spot, Last Wish, can change and swap with the number 3 raid. So, this raid, when I'm meaning these races were tight, these were tight. Now, Last Wish was 2 points ahead of Vow of the Disciple, which is very, very, very small. Keep in mind, 1 and 2 are only 1 point ahead of 3 and 4, so at least based on how I did it. But your fun fact for Last Wish was it is still to this day the only raid to have a post-final boss encounter. No other raid has one. Still. Now, again, if there is an encounter outside of the raid, that does not count. It has to be within the raid itself. Looking at you, Preservation. Looking at you, Excision. For Salvation's Edge and Vow of the Disciple, of course. Preservation, Vow of the Disciple, Excision. I can't pronounce it very well. Salvation's Edge, right? Not counting those because those activities are not in the raid itself. So, however, Last Wish is the only raid and dungeon to have one, which is kind of crazy that they never revisited that concept. Right. And I find to be quite surprising, honestly. However, Last Wish did win one award. That one award was for extras. And y'all know why that is. But before we get there, let's break it down. Let's get it into the difficulty here. Now,
Top
Last Wish
left.
I actually identified as easier than Vow of the Disciple. Mainly, again, in order to be considered a difficult raid, you have to be unable to get through the entire raid purely by ad clearing. Now, keep in mind, you would think Cali eliminates this, but the cheese for Cali is actually quite common in LFG nowadays. It's like, well, it's like a 50-50. A team will either 50-50 cheese, cheese Cali or not cheese Cali. And then, of course, you have Shuro G, 2 ad clears. You go to
Why
Morghast.
do I hit top left?
The encounters are not intensive enough for me to be like, yeah, you're not an ad clear role. Generally speaking, you just pick up the Take and Blight, and that's all you do.
Oh.
So, like, that's kind of just it. I'm not. We'll discuss Morghast here a little bit more in depth a little bit later when we really start talking about the experience, because the experience is going to be a little bit nuanced. The experience is going to be a little bit more nuanced. Y'all are gonna know why when we get to Riven. But then, of course, for Vault, those same 2 ad clears can just ad clear again. Then you go to Riven. Again, you just do damage. And then, of course, Queen's Walk is the last encounter, and that's the only encounter where you cannot just truly ad clear. You actually have to pay attention to the mechanics. So for that reason, it didn't get, a 2 out of 5, which would be really easy. Really easy. Or it didn't get something like Rid of Nightmares did, a 1 out of 5 in terms of there's barely any difficulty in the raid at all. But I do think the raid is decently challenging, especially for, however, if you know what you're doing, this raid is a blast to get through in terms of, like, it's stupidly easy. And even, like, for new people, it's not that hard. Like, the raid's pretty fine. Like, it's just a solid mid-level of difficulty. Identify mid-level difficulties, raids by, of course, how is it a challenge for veterans? Is it too hard for new players? A raid that is too hard for new players are those, like, upper echelon, like, harder difficulty raids, being like Desert Perpetual, you should not be doing as a new player. Vow of the Disciple, you should not be doing as a new player, at least in my personal opinion. Those should definitely not be your first raids, point blank, period. But again, number 3 level raids, I decide, like, hey, these are raids you could do at a mid-level. These are raids you can do like when you're a mid-level raider. You're gonna have a great time. It's a comfortable raid if you're a mid-level raider. It's easy for, of course, experienced raiders, and it's gonna be a little bit more challenging for first-time raiders. So that's where I kind of identified that. Now, experience. Experience, we are going to go through the individual encounters here in this particular section. Because this raid has been out for quite some time, there are various cheeses and whatnot, so I am going to be discussing those, because again, these are the raids in their final states, right? I know some raids do have an arguably buggier history. Cough, cough, Deep Snow Crypt, cough, cough, what the fuck was those early stages? But however, those cheeses have been patched out. Meanwhile, with Last Wish, I am going to be discussing some of the cheeses that exist in the game, because those cheeses are used relatively commonly compared to a lot of other cheeses you might find. Now, for Last Wish, of course, you go in, first encounter is Cali. It is a 50-50 chance whether or not this will be done normally or cheese. If the team is prepared, like, cheese will be the preferred route. However, if somebody accidentally starts the encounter, most teams will just immediately swap to doing it normally. However, how you're supposed to do it normally is around Cali's arena. There are 3 sets of 2 symbols. Everybody has to get on a plate, on the plate that coincides with their symbols. The plates, however, are divided into center, left, and right, and you have to stand on the one that doesn't have a blight popping out of it. When you've finished that, when you stand on the correct section and a certain amount of times, a knight will pop up, you kill it, and that lets Cali, during her damage phase, to open doors. If you do not finish all of them, not all of the doors will open. And the amount of doors that will open will depend on if, how many things you've opened. So, and then, of course, you damage Cali in the middle, but that's besides the point. How the cheese operates, I don't mind the cheese necessarily, because the rest of this account is just very, very easy. So I'm indifferent on running it either way based on the experience. But basically, it does require Anarchy. I don't know if you can do it with Witherhoard. You might be able to do it with Witherhoard, but everybody does it with Anarchy. So you have one person looking at Callie in the face, prepared to stick her with Anarchy. Then you have one person on one of the plates that's closest to the entrance. Then they step on it, you tag Callie immediately, and then you run back over to where everybody's at. You tag the ground, and then you tag Callie again to keep her there. Everybody does damage. You nuke her, bada bing, bada boom.
And I got.
Then of course you have a secret chest, parkour section, and then you have
Alright.
you don't have a secret chest after that. I'm pretty sure. I believe it's Shirochi. No, you do have a secret chest. Don't trust me. You do have a secret chest. I had to mentally run through the raid a little bit myself.
It's open.
Now, interestingly enough, if it is your first time running the raid, you will actually want to do the wish wall and get an extra key, which I think is a big bonus to the general experience of the raid. I'm gonna get into a little bit more of the wish wall when we get to secrets, but you can get a key, you can get an extra key if you're a new player running it, which is why whenever I'm running the raid, I'm like, hey, has anyone ever done this for the first time? Because I'm not going to have to enter in that code. But also, there is an extra key you can get that unlocks a chest that is key specific halfway through. It's about halfway through the raid. It's just before Vault. It's just before Vault, which is about halfway through the raid. And it gives you, I believe, a legendary ship, if I remember correctly. That's how you get that legendary ship. But outside of that, Shirochi. Shirochi, I think, is a pretty fun encounter. In my personal opinion, it's a lot more fun if you're actually doing the mechanics over just ad clearing through it. If you just ad clear, do damage. Ad clear, do damage. Ad clear, do damage. There is a cheese for this, however, it's not commonly done necessarily because it is very time consuming. When the raid was a little bit more difficult, like when we didn't have things like particle reconstruction and even breach and clear, this cheese even then wasn't used commonly. Nowadays it is rarely used unless you have a bunch of new people. That's the only time I've really seen it done, but most people are just like, it's gonna be faster to just do this encounter normally. Now, I'm not completely sure how the cheese works, so I'm not necessarily going to explain it. What it does result in is after you've damaged Shirochi 3 times, you have to do the puzzle where, hey, you look at the wall, read it like the book, stand on the places that are blank slots on that tile. You switch to the middle one, same thing. Right one, same thing. Again, I'm not explaining these encounters in depth. I'm not teaching you how to do the raid. But instead, what the cheese will do, well, the things which have already, like the teacups, will already have spawned down. So that aspect you don't have to do. And then you can just keep going up. Normally, this is not how it happens. Normally, you do assign 4 people. You number them 1, 2, 3, and 4 and they will correspond with the blank slots. So whatever is the top leftmost one will be 1. And and then of course you'll have 2, which whoever's the next blank spot, then 3, and 4 will take whatever the bottom rightmost spot is. I usually will have the newest people take 1 and 4 because those are the easiest, and then I will, I usually take 2 or 3, and same with someone else that is experience. But that is kind of the gist of that encounter. I think Shirochi is a very fun encounter. I think it's pretty fun. I don't think it's the best encounter on this raid, no, but it's not my personal favorite. But in terms of how fun it is for the team as a whole, it's one of the better encounters. And then, of course, after Shirochi, you get to Morgeth. Morgeth is why this raid lost a point in terms of experience. I do not like this encounter. By the way, I have attempted to do this encounter in Pantheon. We did manage to complete 1 rotation, but of course the team splintered off, so at that point I just cheesed Morgeth the next day. I also didn't have time to sit there and just learn the shit. But I'm not the biggest fan of how Morgeth operates seemingly in Pantheon either. Again, the Pantheon iterations of raids are not considered, because otherwise King's Fall would have a massive advantage. Because Golgoroth was there originally. Then I believe Orcs also had a version as well, and then War Priest had one as well. But War Priest has one in this new Pantheon. But the original one, I believe it was Orcs and Golgoroth that had versions. Which is interesting. But how Morgeth War normally works, again, Bubble Cheese has been patched, but outside of that, the take and strength mechanic It took me like it took me over 5 runs to even grasp how Morgoth worked. Because a lot of the times it kind of just seems like you throw shit at the wall at Morgoth and then just see what sticks, and then you do damage from there, and he's dead. So Morgoth is a little bit of a weird situation. I'm not going to explain how the encounter works necessarily here, but honestly, really only 2 people are doing mechanics. And if you have a new person, you'll just have them pick up the first Sacred Strength and then pick up the last one. They'll just add through the rest of the encounter.
And
But Vault. Vault is my personal favorite encounter. Vault is my personal favorite encounter. Because I like reading and then using that knowledge to read. The only unfortunate part is the other people just act clear. Again, and that goes into the difficulty part, but it is very fun. It is quite fun. Now, I will say just a little bit about the music. I like Vault's music. Vault's music is great. But then, of course, you have Riven. Riven is the main point of contention. Here's what I'm going to say. If you have inexperienced people on your team, cheesing Riven is flat out better. It is flat out better. Unless they are really willing to learn Riven legit.
Yeah, bro.
Here's what I will say. Everyone should run at least Riven legit once. However, I think it also depends on how communicative your team is. If no one on the team really talks that much, you should not be running Riven legitimately. You should not be running Riven legit unless you know the vibes are good with the team and the team is pretty talkative. Because that communication is extraordinarily important for that encounter specifically. I actually personally really enjoyed doing Riven legitimately. I think it adds to the experience rather than taking it away. You get to see Riven multiple times instead of just like twice. We'll talk about Riven's model when we get to Spectacle, but Riven, I think it's a great encounter. Then of course Queen's Walk. Again, Queen's Walk can sour your experience with Last Wish if not enough people are talking. However, again, communication. Queen's Walk can be quite smooth, easy peasy, and of course when you notice that you're going back through the vault, back through like the early stages of Riven encounter, and going down to the vault, I think it's pretty cool. So when you kind of route it in your brain like that, I think it's quite cool. But overall, Last Wish, I gave it a 9 out of 10 experience, so it was an absolutely phenomenal raid. Phenomenal raid. Now, let's get into the Spectacle. Raid's beautiful. Raid's beautiful.
Why?
Even though, yes, there are some sections that are in the Ascendant Plane, it doesn't have the issue that Shattered Throne does in terms of it just stays in the Ascendant Plane. It's barely in the Ascendant Plane itself. I do like Riven's boss model. I will say, again, it did get a 10 out of 10 in terms of Spectacle. If I were to give it a nitpick, it would be that you don't get to see Riven's full body model outside of when you fall down. I wish you got to see a little bit more of it. But absolutely phenomenal raid visually. Keep in mind, there was a 4-way tie between all of the top 4 raids. So there were tiny things that had to inch it out, and the top 4 raids, I think I like slightly more visually, but not enough to dock at a point. But a beautiful raid. Now for music, I really like the music of this raid. I really love Last Wish's music. Especially Vault is probably my favorite piece. I think Riven's piece is pretty good as well, but Vault, it should be bumping in this raid. Keep in mind, not my favorite music. It did not tie with the top 3. It tied with one of the top 3. I can't say what that is yet. But no other raid, there was only the top 5 raids even got anything higher than a 3. So again, the top 4 rather. Yeah. Okay. Let me rephrase that. Outside of Garden of Salvation, only the top 4 got high marks for music. So again, Last Wish music was pretty good. Now, in terms of loot, it got a 7 out of 10. Out of the final 5 raids, it was, at least in my personal opinion, the second most lackluster. Again, there was one out of the top 5 that was more lackluster than Last Wish, but we'll get to that raid in a minute. But Last Wish, right? It got saved by 1K. 1K has a spotty history. It has a spotty history. it is either stupidly strong or rough to use without much in between. The biggest issue with 1K
Or
was the ammo.
reconstruction,
It was the ammo reserves. Like the max
Yeah,
ammo
practical
was
reconstruction.
is and still to this day not great. However, the catalyst added enough interesting stuff to it to where it's like, ooh, this thing got puts a lot more damage. Me likey. So I really actually do like,
Another trigger.
1K in its current state enough to bump it up a little bit. But there were two other weapons that were the reason why it did get decently high marks for. And those two weapons are Supremacy
For
and Apex Predator.
for 73.
Keep in mind, another reason why I tag points with it is those are the only weapons even worth noting.
It doesn't have
I
bullets,
think there is
but,
Chattering
he
Bone,
doesn't
Scout
really
Rifle.
compensate
There's a
for-
Pulse Rifle that gets Transfiguration. I might be swapping those
that's
two,
just
but
timing.
there's that. There is also a Fusion Rifle being Tachyon Force, which is alright, but in my personal opinion, there's better Arc Fusion Rifles. And then, of course, there is the Hand Cannon Nation of Beasts, which is an awful Arcane Cannon. So, also, the Origin trait is kind of mid-tier as well. If it wasn't for Apex, Supremacy, the armor set bonuses, which we'll get to in a minute, and 1K, it would have gotten less points for the loot. But Supremacy is a kinetic sniper. It was the first one, if I remember correctly, it was the first one to actually get kinetic tremors on it. It had rewind rounds and kinetic tremors, which is really good. So it is also Overload, I believe. It is an Overload sniper, which is honestly not necessarily what I would recommend using for an Overload champion, but at least it's alright. It did suffer the issue of coming out after Succession, but it had kinetic tremors, so it was used as sort of a burst DPS in a way when you ran out of heavy ammo. So that's what its niche kind of was. And then, of course, Apex Predator was the first rocket launcher to get bait and switch on it. So that was absolutely huge. Well, not it wasn't the first rocket launcher to get bait and switch, but it had another perk on it as well.
Wouldn't that be the correct one?
Oh yeah, it had Reconstruction. Reconstruction bait and switch was the god roll at the time. Back in my day. Now, the Origin trait is not even worth mentioning. It doesn't really do anything. However, the armor set bonus gives bonus that generates ammo. It's based around weapons, ammo, and grenades. If you are spamming heavy ammo weapon, you should be using that set, especially if you're spamming grenades with. However, I do not personally use this set because the only heavy weapon that I really use like that is the Arc LMG Bitter End, of which, because it's a heat weapon, there's a better armor set for it. So, however, if you're using like a rocket launcher or something like that, the armor set bonus is honestly quite good. And of course, 1K is absolutely phenomenal as well. So that's why I got high points for loot. Now, in terms of extras, of course, the Flawless Triumph is Flawless is required for the title, which I like. Also, you do have Wish Under Eggs in there to which if you find all the Wish Under Eggs, I'm not counting for this raid necessarily. However, I do like that they are featured in the raid, but you end up getting a Taken Sparrow, which is cool. Which at the time it was the only way you could get a Taken Sparrow, because again we didn't have the Taken Skimmer, we also did not have the Taken Shader at all either. So there's those things of note. Now, I will say the armor set looks decent. It looks alright. I do like how the weapons look, though, as a whole, so it kind of got some points for that. However, the main thing is, and the reason why I won that award for Best Extras is y'all know that Wish Wall. That Wish Wall lets you go to any checkpoint, Morgoth, Riven, like it lets you go to all of them. I will say, you can't do I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing Queen's Walk unless you've done Riven, because Riven, you can't open up the chest without the token that drops from Riven. But you can go and do any of that. There's a code to spawn in the eggs. There's a code to give the players random heads. There's, of course, the code to give new players an extra key. And then also, there's a code to give players that extra chest key for that ship. And there's, codes to change voice lines. There's just so much to this that it is extraordinarily cool. In my personal opinion, I would not have minded feats as much if you could decide if you wanted to do that when you launched into the raid, and there was something like maybe something similar to the Wish Wall where you could make things a little bit more difficult if you wanted to for that extra loot. But Of course, you know, there's a whole bunch of stuff with the wish wall. I absolutely love having that wish wall, and it would get tied into a seasonal story thing later on, but I digress. So yeah, that's the main reason why it won the best extras, was because of that wish wall. So there's that. And there's also one for an extra emblem. So there is Last Wish. I know, a beefy section for our number 4 spot. But of course, it was outside of the top 3. And then, of course, to start off our top 3, we have King's Fall at number 3. And it is our first raid in S tier. Now, your fun fact for King's Fall is that it was the first raid to have multiple enemy types in it. Because it goes from Fallen to Taken, and it was the first raid to do that. Not in Destiny 2, well, actually, not in Destiny 2's history, but this is more so of a in Destiny franchise history. So that is for like D1. Now keep in mind, again, with Vault of Glass, King's Fall, and Crota's End, I had to come up with some mildly obscure ones, because again, those rates are older. Like those rates are a lot older. So, but King's Fall was the first raid to have dual enemy types in it. Now keep in mind, there, at least in the game currently, outside of maybe Salvation's Edge, like I said, the only enemy type I could see in there was Dread. But Vow of the Disciple has Scorn and Taken, and at least in the game right now, that is the only other raid to have dual enemy types, that being like Vow of the Disciple. But a lot of dungeons have them. At least Warlord's Ruin has Taken, Scorn, and Grasp of Avarice has Hive, then Fallen. So that's just something to keep in mind. But King's Fall did win one award, and that was for Best Music. Y'all know why Oryx's music is just peak. Absolute peak. And the rest of the music for the raid is honestly really good as well. So, yeah, King's Fall did have my absolute favorite music. Now, of course, we're going to go ahead and start off talking about the difficulty. Now, for difficulty, King's Fall, I gave it a 3 out of 5. It's a little bit harder than mid-tier raid. Now, again, I define this out of the free-to-play raids. I define this as the mid-level raid. It's too hard for absolute new people, and it's hard for to baby raiders, and easy to old man raiders. So that's why it's kind of there. Now, for experience, of course, you can't be a top 3 raid without having a 10 out of 10 experience. So, and you can't be, you gotta, come on. Experience is one of the most important things. 10 out of 10 King's Fall experience. Now, as we go through here, we're going to kind of combine experience and spectacle together, and the spectacle being a 10 out of 10. However, of course, y'all know there was a 5-way tie with spectacle with King's Fall, and only one of the top 2 raids is also tied with it. But, of course, the other raids are Vow of the Disciple, Garden of Salvation, Last Wish, and now, of course, King's Fall. In terms of spectacle, there is one other raid that hasn't been mentioned yet because it was 5-way tie. But we're going to kind of combine the two here because that's kind of important here. Because the spectacle does add quite a bit to the experience, right? But, in terms of experience, King's Fall is a phenomenal raid. I will say the intro does feel a little claustrophobic, being of course, the opening encounter does feel a little bit claustrophobic at times. I will be discussing things like Court of Oryx, the way the Red Border Chest works. I'll explain some of that when we get to extras and that sort of thing. But going into this, for totems, I think it's a fun encounter. Now, just to mention it here, Pantheon's iteration of War Priest combined totems and War Priest together. I do think, War Priest was fun as well. Do I think it made the encounter better? I'm going to say no. Here. By the way, I don't quite remember how Oryx and Golgoroth quite worked. So, for those reasons, I'm kind of just going to... I'm not going to really mention those. But War Priest, I didn't think the Pantheon encounter made it better. I think Totems just works perfectly fine as an individual encounter. But Totems, I think, it's a very, very fun encounter. Again, I do define difficulty in terms of, well, and even experience. Can everyone go through, can you get through the raid with just ad clearing? And the answer to totems is yes, but preferably no. Still to this day, totems is generally ran as two teams of three. Now, when it's ran as two teams, like 3 teams of 2, usually 2 people will be doing the mechanics and the other 2 people just be acting in the middle. That's kind of all they do. However, most teams don't like running it like this because the timing is like can be quite tight on the 2 runners. So you prefer that everybody does the mechanics. And then of course for War Priest, 3 people do mechanics, 3 people don't. Now, for War Priest specifically, again, this is where we get into just a little bit of some strange territory, but, and there was something I forgot to mention about, which I shouldn't have, but we'll get there. But for War Priest specifically, some people, like most people nowadays, kind of like to run it in terms of if you are standing on the plate, you also kill the brands. However, some teams will not do that so that the ad clears actually have something to do, and they will be the ones killing the knights, claiming the brands over the plate holders themselves. Now, something I did forget to mention, unfortunately, was the bridge jumping puzzle. The bridge jumping puzzle, I can't believe I forgot to talk about that. Now, keep in mind, the in-game footage is going to be completely separate. The in-game footage is actually going to be in order. What I'm talking about is not going to be. But the bridge jumping puzzle looks absolutely phenomenal. It is beautiful. That's what I got to say about that. It's all over. But moving on to Golgoroth, of course you have Golgoroth's mains, which has a little bit of a puzzle in there. Again, not mentioning that kind of stuff until we get to the extra section. But when you get to Golgoroth, as an encounter, I think it's decently fun. I think it's a little less fun than the other 2 raids that are ahead of King's Fall. But Golgoroth, I still think is a pretty fun encounter. There's a little bit of nuance here as well. For example, if you're one of the stunners for Golgoroth in terms of shooting his back, some teams will have a tractor cannon, so that when you're crossing over to when you have Golgoroth's gaze, you run past his legs to tractor him to debuff him, and then run along to the rest of the team. I will say the fun aspect of Golgoroth is that somebody is cursed by light, or they basically turn into a cursed thrall. I forget what it's called exactly. But when they get that debuff, if they don't run away from the team, they'll kill everybody else except for them. I think that is really funny, and it leads to quite some funny moments. If somebody forgets to run away from the team, or at least run away into Golgoroth, or keep in mind, if you're at the last 2 bubbles, usually whoever's cursed will go away from the team rather than towards Golgoroth because it's just too close. But it's absolutely phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. So yeah, the encounter is quite fun. Then of course you have the Dick Wall. Great visuals. And then, however, the real spectacle is in that final encounter. You see Saturn in the distance. So cool. So cool. Even the daughters there look menacing as well with their pyramid heads and whatnot. They do look menacing. Absolutely phenomenal. But daughters, pretty good. Like I said, Golgoroth is too simple for me to consider there being a true ad clearing counter, because you're doing damage, but also you gotta help shoot down the bubbles as well, and you have to manage your debuff. For daughters specifically, there is a chance you can ad clear through the rest of the raid. However, there's no guarantee, because usually how most teams will do this is the ones closest to the entrance where you came in is L1, R1, obviously left, L being left, R being right, and then the ones closest to where orcs will later spawn is L2, R2. This has mainly came from the Deepstone Crypt way of naming things at least on PlayStation, in terms of, hey, it's such an easy way to teach. Hey, you got a controller in your hands? Alright, flip it up to where the triggers are pointing to the sky. Look at your buttons, that's how we call them. L1, L2, R1, R2. Ones are closest to us where we are right now. 2s are furthest away. It's easy to remember, and it's easy to explain. You don't have to be like, you don't have to argue front or back. What is the front? What is the back? Also, instead of having to say front left, back left, say L1, R1, L2, R2. Like easy peasy lemon squeezy. So, usually I take the, like, I almost always take the twos. I think I've only taken one of the ones a single time. I think I've only taken it a single time. But that's because I wasn't fast enough to clean the twos. So usually you'll have, of course, one person on each plate. Then you have one ad clear in between the twos and the other ad clear in between the ones. The reason why I'm ad clear here, they will ad clear until someone gets taken with strength. Like they get taken. Let's say, for example, L2 gets taken. L2 will call out, "Hey, I'm taken," and then whoever the ad clearer is going to take over the duties that they would have had on that plate. If it's not selected to stand on, you don't stand on it. However, if it is selected, that ad clearer will then stand on that plate. But also, the ad clearer can become taken and have to go to whatever plate is called out first, so they have to pay attention. Then, of course, when they get on that plate, the second person will get on their plate when it's called out. Then you got to do a little bit of parkour. Parkour 3 times. Dunk on whichever wizard, and bada bing, bada boom, do damage, killer, repeat process. And the encounter works very similar to Oryx as well, but Oryx is a little bit different, as I'll get into a little bit later. But Daughter's design is also, I think, pretty cool. Looks very similar to Pyramid Head. I can't see them as anything other than Pyramid Heads. Now, on to Big Boy Oryx. Peak boss design in Destiny. Oryx is peak. And the music, his entrance is so cool as well. He's huge. To my knowledge, he's number 3 if I remember correctly. If I remember correctly, Riven I believe is bigger than him. However, it is argued that him and like Oryx and Riven are kind of tied. But the Witness completely outscales them. So, but Oryx, fucking huge, big boy. Great design and everything. There is a mini version of him as well, but we'll get into there a little bit later. Now, in terms of the raw experience, right? Daughters, pretty easy, pretty fun. Oryx is a little bit more stressful, but still fun. I think it's still a very fun encounter. Pretty much works the exact same way as Daughters did, except for 2 major differences. One, he has a chance to. This will be after the first damage phase, but after when you damage him the first time. But he will either spawn knights in meteors, or he will spawn the bubble that will summon people into him. You have to kill him to despawn it early. You have to kill him to despawn it early. But to at least teleport everyone out of it. Now, the other thing that makes this a little bit more challenging is the Light Eaters and the Ogres. The Ogres will drop little taken balls when you kill them. However, you have to look on the opposite side of the arena, and you have to, usually you'll have a sniper for this, but you'll have to snipe but destroy the Light-Eating Knights. So that is something important of note. But, again, you're just 3, 2, 1 bombs. Bada bing, bada boom. Bomb shenanigans. Final Stand is pretty cool as well. You can stun him up to, I believe, you can stun him up to 2 times. You can stun him up to 2 times. When it first starts to damage, you'll detonate the first bomb, and then after it starts it up a second time, you'll detonate the second bomb. At least that's how some people do it. Some people also just detonate both for the sake of it. But I will say his animation where he perishes and he falls back into Saturn is quite cool as well. We do know his body ends up on Titan because of the Ghost of the Deep Dungeon. That's where his body ends up. I think it would have been cool to see his body resurrected. I think it would have been pretty cool. Instead of just getting whatever the fuck episode Heresy was. So, I think it would have been cool to see him return in some respect. But, all in all, great raid to run. Very, very fun. I personally love the raid myself. Now, of course, loot is where it lost a lot of points. So keep in mind, it was hidden. It was hidden until you get to loot. because one touch-off balance is not particularly the best. Catalyst does help it a little bit. But the main problem, again, is the legend is the armor set bonus. In my personal opinion, I'm not the biggest fan of it. Again, just keep in mind, I'm not the biggest fan of general stuff. I like stuff that's I like stuff that is like stuff that's not just generic damage resist. I'm not the hugest fan of that most of the time. But for Kingsfall specifically, Titans don't gain that many of a benefit for being invisible, so it was kind of just useless for me at least. But the main thing here is the weapons themselves. Zhali's Bane is the only one that's worthy of note. But here's a problem with Zhali's Bane. It does not have Heal Clip Incandescent in separate columns. It has Heal Clip and Incandescent in the same column for some fucking reason. Meanwhile, Luna's Howl has Heal Clip Incandescent on separate columns. The fuck are we doing? Here's what I'll say as well. A niche case is used for Defiance of Yasmin. It's an anti-barrier sniper. It is the only raid anti-barrier sniper, because keep in mind, Succession is unstoppable, Supremacy is overload. Defiance of Yasmin is actually anti-barrier. It's one of the few anti-barrier snipers. That is the only reason why you would ever craft it, is for anti-barrier sniper specifically. The origin trait is not particularly the best either. No one uses the Stasis LMG. No one really uses the fusion rifle either. And the scout rifle barely sees any use nowadays as well. I know Firefly and Dragonfly were a thing for a little bit, but don't use it like that. Duma Kelkus is an alright scout rifle, but again, in order to really have that high tier loot, you have to have more than one GOAT weapon. And Kingsfall, even when it was around, it only had one GOAT weapon, and that was Zhali's Bane. But Zhali's Bane is, honestly, in my personal opinion, outclassed by Luna's Howl. And of course, Duma Kelkus has been outcast for ages by pretty much all void weapons. So there's that. That's why I just didn't get high marks for the loot. Now, for Kingsfall, extras. I do like how the catalyst is obtained, being with the Basilisk Court of Orcs. It is a little convoluted for my liking. It takes a little too many steps for my personal liking, but it's guaranteed, so gotta take it where I can get it. Now, discussing the way the red border is obtained, the guaranteed red border is obtained. I like the idea. I am not the biggest fan of the execution. The reason why I'm not the biggest fan of the execution is because enemies can trigger it as well. It's actually, I don't know if they might have fixed this or not, but this specifically goes for totems. If one of the symbols is totems, you have to check one of the symbols in totem specifically. It's the one on the left side, being where the Minotaurs, like the taken Minotaur spawns. You have to check that side, the symbol that's in there, because sometimes it'll be active when it really shouldn't be. So, there's that. Now, it did get some points for Golgoroth's Maze. I like having a chest, having a little mini puzzle for a chest in the middle of the raid. I kind of like it. So, it ended up getting it did end up getting 7 out of 10 in terms of extras. Now, and keep in mind, in the first video, I did say Destiny 2 had no unique hive raids. Kingsfall does come from D1, so this does not count for Destiny 2's no hive raids. So, yeah, but overall, Kingsfall, S tier, really like this raid. It ended up in the top 3, kudos, but again, very minor things separating it. But it was tied with Last Wish in terms of overall score. Now, keep in mind, the top 2 were tied. When we get the top 2 are pretty interchangeable for me, and pretty much depend on where you're at in your rating state or then that sort of thing. So, and I will say, difficulty played a hand on determining this. And in our number 2 spot, we have Deepstone Crypt. Now, Deepstone Crypt is personally my favorite raid. It is personally my favorite raid. Just like Grasp of Avarice is my favorite dungeon. However, I do not think Deepstone Crypt is the best raid, and I don't think Grasp of Avarice is the best dungeon. I think Equilibrium is the best dungeon, despite it not being my favorite. It is my number 2 favorite, but not my favorite. Now, Deepstone Crypt is number 2. Before we get into why it's number 2, that sort of thing, let's get into its fun fact. Deepstone Crypt is, by the way, of course, an S tier. Deepstone Crypt is the only raid and dungeon to have both bosses not being their only appearance. Being, of course, Taniks has appeared multiple times in Destiny 2 and in Destiny 1. And Atrax appears in Vesper's Host. And, like, Atrax appears in Vesper's Host. So, those are the reasons that I stated that. And usually, even if you don't want to consider that, Atrax does appear, at least in cutscenes, in the base game as well. The reason why you cannot necessarily count this for the other raids necessarily is because if you look at, we're going to skip dungeons here, but if you look at Destiny's history, if you want to look at Vault of Glass, right, both bosses don't appear in terms of, like, in a cutscene, right? King's Fall Orcs does. War Priest you can argue, but, like, does Golgoroth? Golgoroth? No. Most of the bosses don't. Crota's End. Crota's does, yes, but Erdute does not. And I'm not talking about gameplay trailers, right? I'm talking about the actual campaign cutscenes themselves. Both bosses do not appear for Crota's End. Last Wish. Morgoth. Shirochi. Cat-like, nah. Garden of Salvation. No. Vow of the Disciple. Wolk doesn't. Neither bosses appear. Neither boss appears at all. Root of Nightmares. Neither boss appears. Desert Perpetual. Neither boss appears. So yeah, Deepstone Crypt is the only one where they appear multiple, like both bosses appear outside of the raid. Which is honestly a little bit strange that that's the only raid that's the case for. This was one of the harder raids. I will say, if y'all do want to have another fun fact, it is the only playable Fallen raid in the game. It's the only playable Fallen raid. Because Scourge of the Past doesn't exist. Destiny 2 has only had 2 Fallen raids. Which is crazy. Crazy to think about. Considering that there are 9 raids that you can play in the game currently and only one of them is Fallen. But we'll say, another fun fact is both Cabal and Fallen only have 1 raid. The rest of the enemy types have multiple. Taken have 1.5. Vex have 3. Hive do have 2. So, and then Dread do have 1, but they're the newest enemy type. If you consider the older raids, like Scourge, is the only other one. So Fallen have the least amount of raid representation in Destiny history. Well, Destiny 2's history. Because keep in mind in D1, there were no Cabal raids either. There was 1 Fallen one, so they kind of balanced each other out a little bit. So yeah, that is a little bit of a fun fact for you. Fallen have been featured in 2 dungeons. Well, in 2.5, like in 1.5 dungeons. Vesper's Host and then half of Grasp of Avarice. Because keep in mind, half of Grasp, like the first encounter is Fallen. Same with the entrance encounter is Fallen. There's a mix of Fallen and Hive in Grasp of Avarice. So yeah, Fallen don't have very much representation in raids or dungeons. So there you are. Now Deepstone Crypt. Deepstone Crypt did win 2 awards. Woo! And they actually won our last 2 awards. Now keep in mind here. Not technically our last 2 awards. Our number 1 spot got 1, but it's kind of one of those kind of things. So Deepstone Crypt got an award for Best Experience and Best Loot. Got experience for Best Experience and Best Loot. Now, before we talk about those awards here, we got to work our way down, and the reason why it lost to the number 1 spot is because of difficulty. This raid initially, before I replayed Root of Nightmares, was the easiest raid in the entire game. Keep in mind, at this point, I had replayed all of the raids outside of Salvation's Edge. I had replayed all of them except for Root of Nightmares and Vow of the Disciple. Those are the last 2. And I still had considered Deepstone Crypt to be the easiest. However, Root of Nightmares would end up beating Deepstone Crypt for easiest raid, but that was its major flaw, was that it's just so easy. It's just stupidly easy. It is easy for new players. It is, again, easy is not that major of a problem, but for this tier list, for this ranking, it is. Now, it is one of the 2 raids that I recommend for new players. Those 2 raids are Vault of Glass and Deepstone Crypt. They're not easy to the point where it's just a carry, generally speaking, but it's still quite easy, right? First encounter, 3-act clear. You're participating in the mechanics very lightly. You're doing damage. Second encounter, again, really only 2 people are doing mechanics. You're just act clearing and then do damage. Chaos Room, 2 people can generally just act clear through the entire thing. It's really not until the final boss where you have to do any sort of mechanics, right? And the mechanics are very simple in this raid. But as we discuss this raid, so let's talk about the experience and spectacle. Experience, it was a 3-way tie, and it was between King's Fall, Deepstone Crypt, and our number 1 spot. However, Deepstone Crypt won for best experience. And then for spectacle, of course, I can officially reveal what was the 5-way tie. The 5-way tie was between Deepstone Crypt, Vow of the Disciple, Last Wish, King's Fall, and the winner of that particular ward, Garden of Salvation. Those were the raids that are like, they're all just so good visually. And they're all very different aesthetically. But this raid holds a special place. Keep in mind, things like spectacle, music, right? They tie into the experience. And this raid is just a fun time. The engine count is pretty solid. The Sparrow section is pretty decent as well. Keep in mind, there's been cheeses over the years, but I'm not going to be discussing those cheeses. But when you get to the first actual encounter, it's pretty good. I like teaching this raid, of course. I have over 100 clears in this raid alone. So, this raid doesn't make up a third of my clears, but it's kind of close. Cause I'm around, if I remember correctly, I'm around the 350 mark in terms of raid clears. So this doesn't make up an exact third, but it's kind of relatively close to it. But I have over 100 clears in this raid because I love teaching it that much. And also, it had a loot refresh, so I had to stack on more clear numbers on top of that. But teaching the first encounter is a good time. Scanner is not overly complicated. And in the last video, I talked about those foundational blocks, right? And the reason why Desert Perpetual, I just considered to be such an awful experience. Not as bad as Rooted Nightmares, but again, why I consider it to be a bad, what I consider it to be an awful experience. When a peak raid, and this is for like all these raids, but Deepstone Crypt is where I really make this point. Your introductory encounter is not your opening encounter. Your opening encounter is your Sparrow section, whatever, your intro to the raid. You should not really be learning any mechanics in that section, really. Your opening encounter is where you introduce a light version of the mechanics, a light version of the overall mechanics. For Deepstone Crypt, you learn Scanner. Like, hey, Scanner, you can go ahead, like, Scanner, you look at these panels, they glow yellow. You looking at things and them glowing yellow and you having to call that out is a through line in the rest of the raid. Operator, generally speaking, you shoot panels. Like when Scanner calls out their stuff, you go ahead, you shoot this panel, you go down, and you shoot the panels that they called out correctly. Generally speaking, you shoot whatever is called out as a through line. However, again, there is a little bit of a waviness to this because Aatrax is a little bit different. And same with, but like Chaos, you just shoot a panel. But generally speaking, you shoot panels, as that's the mechanic of Operator. And it's how those things are interwoven together. And then, of course, you have your, hey, this terminal here, this is how you pass the buff along. This is used across the raid. Is it necessary outside of the first encounter and third encounter? No. But is it helpful? Yes. It's knowledge you should know. Those 3 things are introduced in the introductory encounter, but they're introduced in a way where it's simple. So usually what I do, for some teams that are kind of experienced, they'll just have one scanner and the operator, they'll follow the operator or whatever. However, when I teach this raid, I like to have people do mechanics as much as possible. So what I personally usually do, and this makes this for a better experience for everybody. You have one person doing scanning on Darkside. I usually have the 2 new people doing Scanner, and if somebody wants to learn Operator, I'll have that person be Operator. If they don't, I will usually be Operator. just to make sure that I'm going by their call out strictly, right? But they'll call out the terminals, the operator will go down, shoot the panels, and then it's, teaching them kind of the rotation. Okay, it's like, hey, whoever is backup operator, they'll pick up the operator, you scanner, you put your thing in. But don't forget, the servitors have to be dead. He's like, even though ad clear role is kind of important because you have to nuke those servitors and kill those champions. And then, of course, y'all know, shoot the fuses, bada bing, baba boy. And then you progress and you see the veiled statue or whatever, which is kind of cool. Then you go in, you have a you have a scene playing out of Taniks being revived or healed in a way, and he, beats his fist on the glass and then scurries on up, then Aatrax kind of teleports away. Pretty cool! Raids don't really do this after this. They really don't. Valor Disciple doesn't do it. Rune of Nightmares doesn't do it either. And Desert Perpetual doesn't either. Well, I guess if you count it Rising from the Floor, which is pretty cool, there's that, but they don't really do it to the effect that Deepstone Crypt does. Ever. So, I'm just like, why did this kind of thing reappear? It's kind of cool. You take a little bit of a chill thing. And then, of course, everybody puts on their Thunder Crash at Parasite. Operator basically doesn't do anything in this encounter, normally speaking. Generally speaking, because I'm a Titan, we're usually able to do enough DPS to do damage. The only important role here is Scanner. Usually, I won't have a player that's their first raid. I won't have the Doom Scanner. If it's somebody's first Deep Zone, but they have raided before, I'll try to have them do Scanner most of the time. But Scanner, they do their thing, kill boss, bada bang, bada boom, and it operates very, very smoothly, but it's cool that you're taking an elevator from the ground to space. And also, it's quite cool in terms of spectacle, in terms of you end the raid where you kind of began it, in a way. I like that. I like that. So I kind of like King Queen's Walk. I like that shit. Then, of course, you get to the third encounter. Third encounter, if I were to nitpick something, it would be third encounter lasts a little bit too long. Third encounter feels like it lasts just a little bit too long. But, again, this raid is stupidly easy. So, everybody just picks a random role. Now, remember what I said. Building blocks. Building blocks. Your next building block happens at that third encounter. That's where you get Suppressor. And Suppressor, you shoot Taniks under the drones, that's it. It stuns them. That mechanic is exactly how it works in the final boss encounter as well. It's not changed. How they interact with the rest of the roles do change. In this one, it stuns them so that the trash bins become free for everybody to dunk their nukes in. In the final boss encounter, it disables it, lets them dunk their nukes in. However, it does have the added thing in terms of it will randomly disable, when you've stunned him, it will randomly disable one of the buffs, operator, scanner, or suppressor, which can be problematic, which is why you don't want your suppressor to stun everything too quickly. You want them to kind of go at an even pace and stun after operator has shot the second bubble. But outside of that, I usually do a little bit of trolling. I usually rock stasis, because suppressor's easy. I will always try to take stasis. This is Chaos Room, so after whatever the roles are explained, hey, pick up whatever role you want. Pick it up. However, I usually call and say, hey, I'm taking suppressor. Because I like that. I like that suppressor. Suppressor is my favorite role. But because it feels a little bit more involved than the other two, at least for me, at least. But even then, your ad clear encounter people, your ad clears are not necessarily doing nothing. Like, if a nuke is spawning and ain't nobody getting it, you better get your ass up there and get that nuke. But then, another cool thing visually is the shielding panels are peeling off of the ship, like peeling off of where Taniks is at, because things are on fire because we are actively crashing into Europa, which is super cool. And then, of course, when we completed the encounter, I usually run stasis because when I sword swipe to the end, I'll put a stasis grenade down at the entrance, and then I will super and try to lock them in with the stasis wall. I love doing that. It doesn't work quite as well nowadays, but it is still a very, very, very fun time. Still a very fun time. But, and of course, crash into the planet, super cool. We get up injured. It's like, I don't know, it's just like, it feels like how the hardest way to explain Deep Stone Crypt, and I know I did skip the Deep Stone Crypt lullaby. But again, we're getting to music later. There is a reason why I am skipping that section. There is quite a bit to that section, so just keep in mind I am skipping that section for now for certain reasons. But when you crash out into the planet or whatever, it's cool. It's cool. It really does feel like you are playing an intense campaign mission with other people. That's kind of how I would describe to it. It doesn't feel like that. Like how Deep Stone Crypt feels is how a raid should feel, and it's how and raids have honestly not felt like that since at least new raids that Destiny 2 has released. Now I'm not talking about the returning ones, but just the raids that Destiny 2 has released. It hasn't felt like that since Deep Stone Crypt. Vow of the Disciple didn't feel like that. Root of Nightmares didn't feel like that either. Same with Salvation's Edge. Okay, man, I did the first thing. I completed the first encounter. I have attended the final encounter, but it didn't feel like that. Desert Perpetual, I have completed it, of course. Desert Perpetual didn't feel like that either. So, Deep Stone Crypt is it's just special because it feels cinematic. And then, of course, when you get out, explain the mechanics, you shoot the trash, and then you have you have Taniks on a shank. You have Shanix. So, and he's fun to deal with. So yeah, and of course he swirls around debris and whatnot, pulls up electric fields and shit. It's cool. It's cool. Spectacle is there in this raid. The experience, the raid is super fun. And the reason why I gave it the award for best experience was because, in my personal opinion, it is my favorite raid in terms of experience. And that's also why I did it as my final raid before uninstalling Destiny 2. And of course, music. Music is great. It did not win an award. There was a three-way tie for music. That tie was with Deep Stone Crypt, Garden of Salvation, and then King's Fall. I just like King's Fall's music a little bit more, but I like Deep Stone Crypt's music. My hot take here is don't get me wrong, I like Deep Stone Crypt Lullaby. I do think it's slightly overrated. I think its weight comes with like doing the raid for the final time. Like that's where I was just like, oof, oof, hitting me in the soul right now. Oof, oof. That's where it kind of started to hit me. Uh, Again, I would never listen to Deep Stone Crypt Lullaby outside of the raid. Never. I would never listen to it. But I do like the music. I do like the music for Deep Stone Crypt as a whole. Um, and this is where we kind of get into the extras. Extras that Duke lose points on. That does have the best flawless shader. In my opinion, Deep Stone Crypt's flawless shader is the best flawless shader out of any raid. However, first off, it does have collectibles. It has an exotic ghost shell, which was the only exotic ghost shell to be attached to a raid specifically until Salvation's Edge. I was told later that Salvation's Edge does have an exotic ghost shell. It is the only other raid that has one. Keep in mind, Prophecy has a dungeon. Like some dungeons have some, so that's why I didn't list the dungeons there. But until until Salvation's Edge, Deep Stone Crypt have the only exotic ghost shell attached to it. But the ghost shell, it looks pretty good. This is the only ghost shell that I've used. Like since I got that exotic ghost shell, because I believe it was my first exotic ghost shell. But since I got that exotic ghost shell, it has stayed on a character for my entire time on Destiny 2. For the rest of my time at Destiny 2, sometimes it would shift to Warlock, sometimes on Hunter, but like it was always on a character. And it hasn't left my Titan in years. Like in years. It has not left my Titan in years. So yeah, it's just that ghost shall stay with me. And then of course, along that little Deep Stone Crypt section, you have two collectibles, but you also do have a little bit of a mini encounter within a parkour section, which Bungie tends to do, but this one was quite decent and quite fun as well. You do have some mild low grav stuff going on, which is pretty cool as well. It mainly happens with the sound design, which is also phenomenal in this raid, but that's just point. But there is, of course, also a secret chest there as well. And it's cool being in space. You're seeing a ship. You're seeing Europa itself. It's honestly quite cool. So, yeah. Cool enough to return as an exotic mission. At least that is static to return as an exotic mission. Deepstone Crypt did in itself, but apparently there was a different version elsewhere. But now we are going to discuss the loot. The loot. Now, it did get award for best loot. And you already know why. Y'all already know why. Out of any raid in the entire game, it has the most goats. It has the most goats. And the ones that fall a little bit behind are still great weapons. Heritage is the best kinetic shotgun in Destiny history. In terms of legendaries. In PvE. Because again, Chaperone is an exception. In PvP, Chaperone is the best kinetic shotgun in Destiny history. I'm going to call that right there. In PvP, Chaperone is the best shotgun in Destiny history in terms of kinetics. But for legendary weapons in PvE, Heritage is still to this day, the best kinetic shotgun in Destiny history. That is my take. Reconstruction Recombination was a GOAT roll. I personally prefer nowadays Reconstruction Focus Fury, unless I'm using it specifically for damage and not just destroying mini bosses and that sort of thing, or even champions. Outside of that, if I'm just using it for boss damage, I will run Reconstruction and something else. But Heritage, GOAT shotgun, but also Succession. Great kinetic sniper. It is unstoppable, which I wish it was anti-barrier, but Focus Fury Reconstruction, or like Reconstruction Vorpal Weapon, absolutely phenomenal weapon. Absolutely phenomenal weapon. One of the best kinetic snipers. And again, Predates suffered because it released after Succession became craftable. So yeah, Succession, GOAT. Also, can't forget about Commemoration, the Void Heavy LMG. Commemoration is an absolutely phenomenal Void LMG. Would you be able to argue it's the best Void LMG? Sure, but GOAT. Also, the weapon's origin traits. It's not a negative. It's somewhat useful. It's more of like that's a nice little bonus. But also, Trustee, Great Scout Rifle. Posterity. Before Palindrome came out, Posterity was my favorite arc hand cannon after it became craftable. Volt Shot Frenzy. Frenzy Volt Shot is a slept on roll for Posterity. Absolutely slept on. Now, nowadays, I prefer Palindrome with Volt Shot Explode Payload. That's my go-to hand cannon now, because it's just a better frame. But considering how weak the particular frame and RPM that Posterity is in, because there is another hand cannon that's there as well, that situation, it's a little bit meh, but those hand cannons are particularly great, but Posterity made it good, which I heavily, massively appreciated. The only weapon in Deepstone Crypt that I would consider to be rough is Bequest. However, Bequest had a period in time where it was a little niche, because it had Surrounded and it was Vortex Frame. It was when Crota kind of first released or whatever, people using Surrounded to beat Master Crota. It was a very weird situation. However, Bequest is one of those alright swords. So, mainly because it's a Vortex Frame, and Vortex Frames eat up a ton of ammo. A ton of ammo. So that is the only unfortunate part. Now, in terms of newer rolls and whatnot, maybe that's made it a little bit better, but to my knowledge, it doesn't have Eager Edge still. So, again, rough thing. Like, nowadays, if your sword doesn't have Eager Edge, you pretty much don't get used. And I think that's the major problem with Bequest as a whole, is that it just doesn't have Eager Edge on it. But, honestly, for what it is pretty decent. For what it is pretty decent. To my knowledge, it is one of the best swords that have Surrounded on it. But, again, you won't see very many people use Bequest. Still, though, decent weapon, but overshadowed by Heritage, Succession, and Commemoration. So, that's why I got there. Now, keep in mind, Eyes of Tomorrow. Again, Eyes of Tomorrow is not offensively bad. Do I like the catalyst for it? No. But it does have some niche use cases, so that's why I didn't dock it anything in terms of that. You didn't raid these. You don't do most of these raids for their exotic, to use their exotic, really, for the most part. Of course, there are exceptions. For example, Last Wish is an exception. And Garnet Salvation as well. That's the main reason you would run it in the first place. And maybe Vault of Glass, but most of them you don't. But for Deep Stone Crypt, you're running it for the legendary weapons. And I do like the armor set bonus. The armor set bonus, spawning little kinetic things is pretty decent. However, the main thing I really like is melee's disorienting nearby enemies. That with Bonk is pretty darn good as a Titan that melees and, does a one-off super every now and then. I like that armor set bonus. The kinetic swarm missiles don't do that much damage, but it's a nice, and like any damage bonus is nice. So, all in all, Deep Stone Crypt, absolutely peak loot. Now, in terms of, we already talked about the extras, it did get 7 out of 10. However, unfortunately for Deep Stone Crypt, it couldn't manage to take that top spot. It didn't manage to take that top spot, unfortunately. And that top spot can only remain to one raid. And in our number 1 spot is going to be Crota's End. Crota's End, in my personal opinion, is the best raid in Destiny 2. Now, I was talking about a number 1 raid here. I will say right now, it did win one award. But, your fun fact here. It is the only raid and dungeon to include the final boss's name in the title. Just as a side note, Grasp of Avarice's boss is Avarok. Not the same thing. And of course, Crota's End is in S tier. But, Crota's End, the only raid or dungeon to include the final boss in the title. In the title of the raid. Which is crazy that it never happened again. And by the way, when I'm talking about raid and dungeon history, I am including Wrath of the Machine as well. I am including Wrath of the Machine in that as well. So that is kind of funny that Crota's End is the only raid where that's the case. Now, first off, the glow up. The glow up for Crota's End is insane. But, you might ask yourself, well, why is it the best raid? Even though it might not be necessarily what you would consider to be your favorite. And, let's get into that here. So, for difficulty, this is what it won the award for hardest raid. Again, keep in mind, Salvation's Edge had this award before I just was like, I'm not going to be able to find the team to do Salvation's Edge. But Crota's End, outside of Salvation's Edge, of course, is the hardest raid in my opinion. Because you should not be doing this raid as a new player. Point blank, period. So when I talked about the free-to-play raids, when I was talking about King's Fall, I consider out of the free-to-play raids, Vault of Glass is a great new play raid. Should be one of your first raids. King's Fall is a mid-level raid, your mid-level raider, and then Crota's End is where you're at your final. When I revisited all of the raids, this Crota's End was generally the hardest. Now, reason for it being the hardest, and keep in mind this is outside of the Featherlight Triumph. I will say out of all the raid titles that I have, and the raid triumphs that I've done, Featherlight was the hardest piece of shit that I've ever fucking done in this game. Featherlight almost broke me because it was the last thing that I was missing for the title. Featherlight was an absolute pain in the ass, but we're not talking about that. Reason being, you kind of can't act clear for almost all of this raid, generally speaking. Outside of the final 2 encounters, there's some wiggle room there. It depends for Urdu. It depends on how dig your damage. But outside of of course, you're not talking about the entrance encounter. Because the entrance encounter is one of the rare ones that actually does introduce the raid's mechanics. A lot of the times, the opening encounter doesn't really introduce you to the mechanics at all. But Crota's End is one of the few exceptions. Keep in mind, Last Wish doesn't even have an opening encounter. But for the first encounter, generally speaking, it's kind of a clusterfuck. Most teams will have an order, or they will just send it. And however, again, that the encounter is ad clear, so it's hard to say that everybody's not like you're just ad clearing. Like that's your point. You're supposed to ad clear, watch traps, watch holes in the ground, that sort of thing. And then of course in the bridge encounter specifically, you can't ad clear to that encounter. You have to know how that encounter works fully. Like everybody has to know how that encounter works fully. You can't just be like, oh, you only know one role and that's it. No, you have to know that encounter fully. And then for early Utes, again, it depends, right? Because the first encounter, only really three people have to know what's going on. Whoever's second damage phase, it escalates to 4, then to 5, and then full fire team, which is impossible. so, so yeah, again, that encounter, it depends. And then of course, Crota, even the people you have on ad clearing the towers, they are technically doing something. So, and most teams do rock 2 swords. They don't usually rock 1 sword. At least most of the time. Usually they rock 2 swords. And usually a tractor and Eversoul. But, I did think it was the hardest raid. I did think it was the hardest raid. Because, yeah, it is, like, even like for an experienced team, it can be, out of all the raids currently, out of your average team of experienced people, I think Crota Zen is one of the few raids that are going to give you a challenge. Like I said, this was tied with 2 of the raids being Vow of the Disciple and Desert Perpetual. However, Desert Perpetual got a lot easier after you kind of know what to do. But that spike in difficulty is very high. In terms of, well, that start difficulty is very high. Kind of like Bloodborne, for instance. But for Crota Zen specifically, this was the only raid that kind of gave me consistent trouble throughout the entire time I was doing the raid or whatever. There was never a point where Crota Zen got super easy. Vow of the Disciple, there were a few runs where I was like, ooh, damn, that was a breeze. Desert Perpetual, ooh, damn, that was quick. But Crota Zen, it was kind of one of those raids where that never really happened, per se. There were some runs, of course, were easier than others, but there was none where it was just completely blasted through, which is kind of surprising when I returned to Crota Zen to record footage for. Now, of course, in terms of overall experience, there was a 3-way tie, of course, between the top 3, King's Fall, Deepstone Crypt, and Crota Zen. I did think Deepstone Crypt was just a slightly better experience than Crota Zen, so that's why Deepstone Crypt got the award over Crota Zen. But I still think Crota Zen is an absolutely fantastic raid to experience. And then in terms of spectacle, I know y'all are gonna get me on this, but I did give it 9 out of 10. It lost a point because slightly too much green. I love green. Green is my favorite color, but a little too much. And the final 2 encounters taking place in the same spot kind of docked it for me. And the reason why I didn't dock it for King's Fall was because King's Fall is very expansive, and King's Fall's final arena looks better than Crota Zen. So I got docked a point. So it was not a part of that 5-way tie. But still, raid looks absolutely great. Now, in terms of music bumps to Crota Zen. Again, not a part of a tie. Again, Crota Zen basically got the top spot a lot of the times, it being number 2 in a lot of respects. But Crota Zen, in terms of music, I thought it was really, really good. I equated it to Last Wish, but again, not a part of that 5-way tie. Now, in terms of loot. Loot was where things got a little... because Crota's End... Well, first off, it did suffer quite a bit by being the last of the remade raids. It did suffer because of that a little bit. However, the only real weapon that was not worth getting from Crota Zen, and still to this day not worth getting from Crota Zen, is Abyss Defiant. That's the only weapon that's really not worth going for. Necrochasm is a slept-on exotic. I just gotta be perfectly honest, it is a slept-on exotic. It does suffer from being kinetic element. I would have personally... It should have been arc. It should have been an arc weapon. I don't know why the fuck it's not arc. It really should be an arc weapon. Should have changed it. It was a perfect opportunity to finally give us a fucking arc exotic from a Raider dungeon since Garden of Salvation, and Bungie decided just to not do that for some fucking reason. But as a whole, Necrochasm is great. Necrochasm is a pretty good exotic, I would say. Again, it did lose a point because of Abyss Defiant. But the armor set bonus, I love. The 4-piece bonus does give you damage resist, which, under normal circumstances, it'd be like, ooh, that's too general. I'm not the biggest fan of that. I like more specific armor pieces. However, the 2-piece set, Even unpowered melees leave off cursed thrall explosions. Is so cool and so sick. It just kind of just gives your melees a little bit of a better AoE. In terms of impact, I really only noticed it very much with it's noticeable for knockout, keeping knockout up. In terms of bam, you melee beef your target. Oh, it makes a beefy target weaker, so then you can knock out and get the health back again. And it helps knockout. But aside of that, it's just really, really cool. I like the Curse Wall Explosion, and it ties in with the raid itself, which is cool. Now, the origin trait, before I discuss the more weapons more in detail, the origin trait, Curse All Explosions, your weapons do Curse All Explosions after you get a melee kill. Pretty sick. Pretty sick. Niche, is it the strongest? No. But honestly, in my personal opinion, it's still very, very solid. The only unfortunate part is, and fortunately or fortunate, depending on your persuasion, the Cursed Thrall Explosions count as arc damage. Which, for arc, it's great because they spawn ionic traces. However, the weapon specifically, that's kind of a negative because the elemental weapons rely on dealing with their actual element. So that's kind of the unfortunate part of that. But, talking about the weapon specifically. Technically speaking, you do have a GOAT kinetic shotgun in there. Well, it's in the kinetic slot, but it is Strand being Swordbreaker. That Strand shotgun. 1-2 punch. Like, shit broken. Shit broken. This is one of the premier shotguns to you to do the whole 1-2 punch shenanigans. At least on Strand. On Solar, you would usually use the Icolo shotgun because that came out, I believe, at this point in time. Right? Don't quite remember. I think the Icolo shotgun came out before, but y'all can correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. But this was the primary shotgun I used on Strand, just for the Strand 1-2 punch, bam, bam, that sort of thing, right? Especially because with Banner of War, your sword is gonna kind of be your ad clear weapon, while also doubling as a pulse damaging weapon. Well, of course you could swap to that 1-2 punch shenanigans, and of course, if you weren't using a sword, Tractor Cannon was your weapon. So there was that. Now, Song of Urdute and Fang of Urdute. The Arc LMG and the Strand Scout Rifle. The problem with Fang of Urdute was that it was a scout rifle. At least that's what the problem is. That's the problem of what it is nowadays. At the time, and pretty much until recent times, there were barely any Strand primary ammo weapons. That issue did not get resolved until much later, so it's not really as much of a thing now. But especially like scout rifles, yeah, like I would say Fang of Urdute is going to be a better weapon on Warlock specifically. But like on Titan, the unfortunate part about, but the part about Strand Titan as a whole is pretty much if you are not a shotgun, SMG, or something like an auto rifle, for example, Rufus's Fury, you can't, if you rely on playing at a distance, yeah, you're not the go-to. You're not the go-to on Strand Titan. You just aren't. That goes for Strand hand cannons as well, but also, did we really ever get a GOAT for Strand hand cannons? No. So, there's that. But Fang of Urdute is still really, really good. Song of Urdute, I do believe is being slept on. I would put it underneath Bitter End. Bitter End is still a better Arc LMG. Especially for ad clear, at least. Song of Urdute is better for damage, of course, but no one really uses Arc LMGs for damage unless you're Thunderlord. And even then, Thunderlord got nerfed. But, again, it's still a really, really solid LMG as well. And, of course, Word of Crota, best Void hand cannon. Best Void hand cannon of all time. In terms of current sandbox, right? Of course, there was a time where Palindrome was one of the best Void hand cannons, like maybe Bottom Dollar as well. But in terms of, in relation to the rest of the Void weapons, Word of Crota, peak. Even back when Palindrome and Bottom Dollar were great or whatever, there were other weapons to contend for that, being Gnawing Hunger, of course, Funnel Web at one point. But when Word of Crota released, and even still to this day, I would argue Word of Crota is still to this day probably one of the best Void hand cannons. or like not just void hand cannons, but void weapons as a whole. Outside of exotics, let me clarify. Outside of exotics, it's still one of the best void weapons in the game. So that's where I like Word of Crota is kind of having a little bit, but again, it lost a point because of Abyss Defiance specifically. But the rest of Crota's End loot is good. The rest of the loot is good. But again, Crota's End and Vow of the Disciple tied. But I think it's because, like, for example, Crota's End, the exotic is better, and the armor set bonus is better. But generally speaking, the Vow of the Disciple weapons are as a whole generally better. But there's of course contenders on each side of the aisle. But getting into the extras here, again, extras. There is a three-way tie for the number 2 slot, So again, Crota's End just happened to be number 2 in a lot of respects. But extras with Crota's End is great, right? The armor set, my personal favorite armor set in the entire game visually. Love Crota's End raid armor. Love that raid armor. Now, and of course, I love the ship, and I love the Sparrow. King's Fall still has my personal favorite raid Sparrow, but Crota's End has my favorite raid ship. Absolute peak. And the Sparrow looks pretty good as well. It did get dock point because I don't like the flawless shader. But here's what I will say. The uniqueness of this raid coming from, okay, there is a number of raid completions that you will have Necrochasm by. However, there's like a set cap on when you can get Necrochasm. In terms of like, by a certain amount of runs, you have to have Necrochasm. If you've been running it once a week, every week. However, you can speed that up by doing triumphs, by doing challenges, and drop that number down then you get Necrochasm low. However, of course, caveat to that, you can't get it on your first run. You can't get it on your first run. Which I do like. First off, the chest. The chest. I do like it. It does require you to remember quite a bit. What I'm not the biggest fan of is sometimes you have to look at where the totems are in kind of a weird way. And when you light a totem, you can't change it, generally speaking. Like when you do that totem, you locking it in. You locking it in. Which is honestly kind of unfortunate and not something I particularly care for. Also, here's what I will say. The Necrochasm Catalyst is interesting to get. It's not my favorite, but again, it's just pretty solid. So, there's that for you. But, those are all of the raids ranked. Going through it again. Again, go watch the previous part if y'all want to hear the fun fact for the other raids. And hey, rewatch this video if you want to go back and look at all the fun facts for these raids. But as a total for raids and dungeons, for raids, the only raid in D tier was Root of Nightmares and Desert Perpetual. They were the only activities in D tier. And then for C tier, you had Garden of Salvation. And then for dungeons, that's where you have Pit of Heresy. In B tier, you have Vault of Glass. Only raid in that tier. For dungeons, that's where I had put Shadow Throne and Spire of the Watcher. Then in A tier, we have Vow of the Disciple and Last Wish. Different dungeons, of course, we had Duality, Prophecy, and Ghost of the Deep. And of course, your top 3 raids were King's Fall, Deepstone Crypt, and number 1, Crota's End. And then for dungeons, you had Warlord's Ruin, Grasp of Avarice, and then your number 1, Equilibrium. So yeah, let me know where y'all would have placed Salvation's Edge. For me, this is based on old experience, I placed it above Desert Perpetual, but below Garden Salvation in C tier. And let me know where y'all would have placed Vesper's Host and Sunder Doctrine, because again, I did not cover those in the dungeon video. Go leave those comments on the dungeon video. But yeah, this is the last Destiny 2 video that I will be posting. Unless there's some random updates. I'm not gonna be tier listing or ranking the exotic missions or the weapons or any of that stuff. This is it. However, I thank y'all for going with me on my Destiny journey as a whole. Those of y'all that are OGs, appreciate y'all. Again, y'all already know the plans, the upcoming plans for the future. When the year mark of Destiny 2 shutting down happens, when that happens, I will likely be making a view. I will be making a video. You know, returning to Destiny 2. I will not be streaming. Again, that was my last stream, unless something extraneous happens. But we will be revisiting it for a video, doing some of the activities or whatever. My thoughts on the raid scene at the time. Don't know what raid I'm going to run. I might just spin a wheel and see what's there. But yeah, on that note though, thanks for tuning in. And for Destiny 2, it's my last time. I'll be catching it on the flip side.